particular es que está presente Tomás Bender, un catedrático de prestigio, dedicada a la historia, dedicada fundamentalmente a clarificar, y en particular temas como este, el excepcionalismo. Ha sido una materia que él ha trabajado enormemente y hoy tendremos el placer de escucharlo. Muchos de ustedes han seguido este tema y en particular menciono que hace muy poquito he recibido de Armando Rivos justamente sobre esta temática, esta labor y tantos otros que han trabajado, Enrique, que han trabajado tanto esta temática. Eduardo Zimmerman hará la presentación de rigor, pero creo que está de más decir muy cosas, en última instancia, tienen que ser leídas con tanta profundidad como este llamado excepcionalismo, porque en última instancia ha condicionado de una manera u otra el siglo XX y seguirá condicionando el siglo XXI. Por lo tanto, este es un tema no solo para escuchar y meditar sobre la historia de Estados Unidos, sino sobre nuestra propia realidad y nuestro propio futuro. Profesor, muy en breve, llegó. Sí, perdón, aviso, hay traducción simultánea, los que necesiten aparatos están a disposición.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Eduardo Zimmerman, soy director del departamento de comunidad de la Universidad de San Andrés. Invitado por el departamento y por la Cátedra de Estados Unidos. Para nosotros es un gran gusto, además, y agradecemos hoy aquí.
Gracias, Eduardo.
Para esta presentación, dos palabras sobre la obra del profesor Bender. El profesor Bender es profesor del Departamento de Historia de la Universidad de Nueva York, donde se desempeña como Dean of Humanities, porque es como decano de las humanidades en la universidad. Su obra historiográfica es muy importante y ha recorrido caras. Empezó siendo un actor muy importante en la historia urbana de los Estados Unidos, para la ciudad de Nueva York. Publicó varios sobre la vida de los intelectuales en esas ciudades y el papel como integrante de las comunidades académicas, no solo las comunidades urbanas, y las tensiones que surgen del papel del intelectual, se integra a su ciudad o se integra a su comunidad disciplinar. En los últimos años, como bien el doctor de Javarini se ha volcado a un movimiento muy importante de historia transnacional o de historia global y a una reescritura de la historia desde esa perspectiva. Su último libro, Nation Among Nations, ha sido publicado en español del siglo XXI, una historia de los Estados Unidos, y está disponible en las librerías. Y este esfuerzo de interpretar la historia de los Estados Unidos como una nación entre naciones, como una nación en el mundo, es parte de un movimiento más general que impacta fuertemente sobre la manera en que vemos las naciones en general, no como esos resultados de una saga patriótica de construcción de una nación, sino como resultado de fuerzas en el que mezclan condiciones locales. Nos permite el fenómeno de las naciones de una manera muy distinta. Y creo que sus ideas sobre el excepcionalismo están en esa perspectiva transnacional del fenómeno de las naciones. So, without further ado, Professor Bender.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate and honored to have this invitation. I also will apologize that I don't speak in English, but that invitation. I guess there's several things I want to say about American exceptionalism. First of all, it is an implausible idea. It is empirically wrong, and I will suggest ways in which it's empirically wrong. I think it is also encouraged that is extremely unhelpful, that can also almost allow the United States to operate as a rogue state. And finally, it leads to mistakes in foreign policy because it looks more than the world outside of itself. And one of the things that some of us are trying to do in the United States now is to teach American history in a way, as has been suggested, to put it in the context of the world so that and how the dynamics dynamics of what we and don't do may work. Anyway, Americans have long thought, and I think people of all nations think, it is different. A lot of the nation is better, and certainly Americans do. That's prideful, but that's not problematic in the way that exceptionalism is. Difference and exceptionalism are two different concepts. A multiplicity of differences. Exception is a concept, is the exception to the rule. It is against the norm. It is only, there can only be an exception, as opposed to many differences. We can have a world of differences, but to claim exceptionalism is to be outside of the norm. That is where the difficulty emerges. That gives a kind of exemption rules, because we are exempt. And exemption is a kind of a privilege. This is a privilege the United States, particularly since World War II, has given itself. That, as should be clear, means that the supposed universals of international law or other agreed upon global commitments are things that are not always taken seriously. Anyone who has the privilege of exceptionalism. The historian Daniel Rogers, a Princeton a few years ago, identified the origin of this kind of thinking in American public life. And it was in the 1940s that this emerged as a I will just mention, if you want more information later, we can talk about it. The first use of American exceptionalism as a specific term came from Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. I don't know if the conservatives who are so in favor of American exceptionalism like that lineage. At any event, the development of this reading of American history came right after World War II. There were two American historians. Well, one was a political scientist. The first one is Daniel Borston, and the other is Lewis Hartz. In the 1950s, wrote books, very different outlooks. Borston, who in the 1930s had been a communist, and then who in the McCarthy era, what is known as names, many communists refused, or former communists refused to name, although they would admit their own situation. Borston named names. And in his post-communist and quite distinguished and influential career, ending up appointed, I think, by Ronald Reagan as Library of Congress, which is a very honorable position. In 1953, while he was still a fairly young scholar, he wrote The Genius of American Politics. And it was an exceptional interpretation of politics in which he basically said there really isn't a politics. We just naturally are the way we are, and it all works well. A couple of years later, in 1955, who was a political scientist at Harvard, wrote The Liberal Tradition in America, which is quite a brilliant book, actually. And he lamented the narrow Lockean consensus of American politics. He explained that the American liberal consensus, that means or conservatism, was the result of the absence of an initial feudal order, which made America liberal at birth, and then, but also with a very narrow spectrum of political conflict. I was actually, my first year in graduate school, I was assigned that book and asked if this was a good for American exceptionalism, and I told the professor, I don't know, the Civil War isn't in the index. So you never know. Anyway, the animating text for exceptionalists that showed up in every textbook, every source, every American history class in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was John Winthrop's lay sermon from the Puritans, a model of Christian charity, a sermon he Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 1630. Interesting, neither Borston nor Hartz had any interest in this religious text. This is the thing that ended up in textbooks. I will talk more about it. This text, along with Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, among some of his other framings, are most often claimed as the foundation and legitimation of American exceptionalism. In fact, none of these things actually make an exception. Both and Lincoln's voice were aspirational, that is, seeking to be the best we can be, which is very different. It may be arrogant, but it is not. In the 1970s, historians' use of the debate about exceptionalism was rare, given the circumstances of the 1970s in the United States, with cities burning and war protests. They didn't seem so exceptional. But the exceptionalism came back with Ron, and it is now still firmly in the hands of the new right. It is the evangelical right. His move into national politics was the occasion for a famous lecture that combined Winthrop and Lincoln in ways intended. In a lecture to the first conservative political action conference in 1974, Reagan delivered a keynote entitled, "We Will Be a City Upon a Hill," and ended with that phrase, or this phrase, "We are indeed, and we are today, the last best hope on earth." That's Lincoln. This sense of exceptionalism is evident in American law at home and abroad, and not entirely the possession of the right. President Bill Clinton refused to join the 120 nations that accepted the jurisdiction of the International Court at The Hague, the court for last resort for crimes against humanity, because, he said, no foreign court should judge American citizens. When the U.S. Supreme Court fairly recently ruled in a 5-4 that juvenile executions were unconstitutional, making a reference to international jurisprudence, the conservatives, especially Justice Scalia, a believer in American exceptionalism, vigorously objected that such standards are irrelevant to the United States. On the other side, on the majority of the decision, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg reminded him that of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson made a direct reference to win the decent respect of the opinions of mankind. Scalia is supposed to live in that part of American history. The neoconservatives in the Bush administration clearly embraced exceptionalism to justify the violation of a variety of conventions, most important, the Hague Conventions on the treatment of military prisoners, something that, alas, is still in Guantanamo Bay. So I'm going to discuss the document of the proponents of exceptionalism, John Winthrop's lay delivered on their arrival in Massachusetts Bay. Turn my paper upside down. A model of clarity was a carefully argued sermon, a quite long one, bolstered by biblical and severe logic, but it did not make a claim for exceptionalism. Indeed, It located their experiment, their city upon a hill, as Winthrop characterized it, to God for sure, but also to the world. One of the most tendentious reading into a claim of exceptionalism. Winthrop was probably, in part, motivated by unspecified troubles on board the ship crossing the Atlantic. His sermon was a warning. It was framed in the context of God and the larger Christian community and non-believers, for that matter. Instead of a boast of exceptionalism, the key paragraph in which the phrase appears after many pages emphasizing humility in the eyes of God and in the world to live up to his commands and their own Christian professions. If read in context, which is provided in 90% of the sermon, his famous and much quoted line cannot be understood of exceptionalism. In fact, if one reads the whole sentence rather than a single phrase, one does not even need the many pages preceding to understand its meaning. Let's consider, this is what he wrote, the eyes of all people are upon us. So if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, we shall be made a story and a byword around the world. So the witnesses of the world Thomas Jefferson had articulated in the Declaration was a key part of the aspect of these documents. Let me make a brief comment as well on Reagan's misrepresentation of Lincoln's line from his second was ever written in the United States. Rather than Reagan's arrogance that the U.S. is the best hope on earth, Lincoln addressed the profound flaw in the that haunted North America from the beginning, the enslavement of millions of people. It is in fixing that flaw, in freeing the slave, for which we shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope on earth. Alexis de Tocqueville is generally considered the author of the exceptionalist interpretation of American history. He does use the word one time in volumes, but it is used in a very restrictive way. And he insists that, I quote him, he cannot consent to separate America from Europe. I consider the people of the United States as that portion of the English people who are commissioned to explore the of the New World. He believed the States emerged in momentary exceptional circumstances, protection from Europe by an ocean without powerful nations on its borders, and it was large when territory was understood to be a resource. Indeed, Tocqueville predicted that because of the size, the United States and Russia would be the dominant powers in the 20th century. More to the point, Tocqueville did not see American history distinct from what, for him, was a universal, providential process that would shape European as well as American history. It is the issue of his great book on democracy in America. That was his focus because that was, in his mind, the face of modernity. If Marx worried about inequality and the formation of antagonistic classes, he worried about the implications of equality. In fact, equality is the central explanatory theme in his classic study of the French Revolution. In The Old Regime and the Revolution, he argued that the roots of revolution going back to Louis XIV. XIV disempowered the nobility. He undermined the hierarchical foundations of the society and the monarchy. Instead of a complex and hierarchical France, Tocqueville argued, became divided between the one, the monarchy, and us. For Tocqueville, the United States was not or even unique. The social condition and process shared by France and the U.S. It was global move toward equality. So the distinctive thing he found in the United States, he also thought was not distinctive. He thought it was a Euro-American phenomenon. In fact, he's quite explicit in the preface to the Democracy, and then for an 1848 reissue of it, and even longer against American exceptionalism. Yet this is one of the books that the exceptionalists continually argue. When I wrote A Nation Among Nations, my intention was to turn an ideological debate that seemed endless, whether or not the United States is or is not exceptional, to an empirical question. Empirically speaking, is the United States engaged in global history and just as one nation, nations? At least to my satisfaction, I think that I had enough evidence. But the other thing, as I dug into this question, is that I discovered historians for 150 years had been avoiding American exceptionalism until the World War II era. And I want to go through some of the things in the United States of the 19th century. George Bancroft, Miss Parkman, the most literate 19th century historian, both framed American history within the larger Atlantic. Parkman is specifically the French in North America. Bancroft included all parts of Europe and even mentioned Tupac Amaru in the upper Platte region of South America. So they were looking in Atlantic-wide, at least Atlantic-wide terms. Likewise, Henry Adams, Frederick Jackson Turner, who's remembered for the frontier, but actually, as I will show in a moment, thought very much about the global American history, and W.E.B. Du Bois, all used at the turn of the last century, two last centuries, 1890s to World War I period. These Americans, Adams, Turner, Du Bois, were struck by the global interconnections in the 1880s and 1890s and saw earlier connections as well. In 1891, he gave his famous lecture, Influence of the Frontier in American History. He wrote or delivered a lecture to Wisconsin school teachers, the significance of history. He says, not only is it true that no country can be understood without taking account of all the past, it is also true that we cannot select a stretch of land and say we will limit our study to this land, for local history can only be understood in the light of the history of the world. Each nation acts on each. Ideas, commodities even, refuse the all are inextricably connected so that each is needed to explain the others. Especially true of the modern world with its complex commerce and means of communication. Each age must be in the light of all past history. Local history must be viewed in the light of world history. These cosmopolitan historians knew what they were talking about. The 1890s were the first modern globalization, using the main indicator used in the 1990s for measuring the degree of globalization, that is the percentage of direct foreign investment. It is clear that the globalization was in the 1890s than the 1990s. And I very important thing that has helped move in our own time the thinking about a global framing of history. Okay, I'd like to now give a couple examples. What I, a moment ago, talked about an empirical sort of argument for the use of exceptionalism, or an empirical, to put it more positively, an empirical demonstration that major events in American history were global, or a part of larger global events, just one part. First, the age of discovery, the Columbus business. In fact, the importance of is less Columbus, and Columbus has been downgraded here.
Yes,
that's fine. The really important thing that happened then, that both Adam Smith and Karl Marx agreed on, is that the global economy, global capitalism begins basically with Magellan, when we discovered that the oceans connect all parts of the world instead of separating. That the oceans seem to be, the Afro-Eurasian world was trapped by the ocean. The Greeks knew that you could, it was round, they even knew exactly how many miles it was in circumference, but we can't, you could, in theory, sail west to get to the east, India, as they named it, but the ocean's in the way. What that was two things: that not only the ocean is not in the way, but the connectors. That changed the world. I think that I'm going to go ahead. Another little example. I want to do a big example. The commonplace account of American colonization is linear. The spatial aspects are ignored. But if we recognize that those Puritans, John Winthrop and those who landed in Massachusetts, their brothers also settled at the same time. Barbados, Honduras, and an island in the Indian Ocean. That makes them look a little bit different than this hard New England world that you imagine. The Dutch foundation of New Amsterdam is treated as it was intended to be modern New York. And religion of the Dutch New York is used to point out its anticipation of a modern American diversity. That line of thinking appropriates what is really a history of the global Dutch commercial empire. Ignored is the near simultaneous Dutch settlement of Batavia, that is today's Jakarta, which had far more diversity and was much more valuable. And after the Dutch lost New York to the British in 1664, 10 years later, after another Anglo-Dutch war, the Dutch had the opportunity to trade Suriname for the recovery of Manhattan. They chose to keep Suriname. Seems to be a good choice, an odd choice now, but at the time when sugar was sweet gold, Suriname was richer and more promising. But the point is that New York was not so at that point. While the usual account takes note of the Portuguese and Spanish empires, it takes little account of the meaning of a world made of empires. The focus of history rather quickly shifts to the English, their contact and interactions with Native Americans. There's another really big problem with even this multinational vision. It overplays the movement of Europeans to America, not because of inadequate Americas, which we're finally doing in our history books, but it assumes that it's a European space. In fact, before 1820, 5 times more Africans than Europeans made the Atlantic transit. Not freely, but they made it, and that was the population. The sources of New World wealth were dependent on various non-European parts of the Afro-Eurasian world, and particularly Spain. The silver. There was so much silver in Mexico and Peru that it would have flooded the silver market and devalued it. Europe was a very primitive economy. They couldn't possibly have kept the value of silver. But lo and behold, the largest economy in the world, 40% of the world economy, beginning of the 17th century, they made silver legal specie, legal contender at that point. So that is for paying taxes. At the same time, the Chinese had a very strong aesthetic preference for silver as opposed to gold or some other metals. As a result, they sustained the silver market. They consumed 50% of what came out of the New World silver mines. If it hadn't been for that, this development project would be limited, considerably limited. Go to 2 key events in American history. The American Revolution and the Civil War. For the American Revolution, my witness of non-exceptionalism in this instance is James Madison, father of our Constitution. In the course of the Constitutional Convention, those of that convention record this comment of his, which seemed to have nothing to do with the provisos of the Constitution. He says, Carthage and Rome tore one another to instead of uniting their forces to devour the of the earth. The houses of Austria and France were hostile as long as they remained the great powers of Europe. France have succeeded to preeminence and to enmity. We owe perhaps our liberty. What he is recognizing is that the war between France and England is the United States came into existence. England and France had been, it was used to be called the Great War until the Great War. From 1689 to 1815, there was constant war between France and England. The 7 Years' War from 1757 to 63 was the First World War. It was a war fought on every continent, and France lost territory on every continent, Africa, India, the New World. And they were a bit angry about that. That the French supported us, the Revolutionary War. It wasn't the 16th thought that a Republican operation would be just the thing. In fact, it did reverberate back. The French expenditures on the war, and it's clear the French won, and Yorktown was a French victory. Already nearly bankrupt French state to finally call the Estates General assemblage for the first time in over 150 years. And that's when things started happening. And that's what led to the revolution. Indirect. In any event, even the Tea Party, spoken of in the United States today, the Tea Party might understand that the Tea Party, the Tea Act, was actually a tax cut, not a tax increase. What happened was the Bank of England was in financial India company, which was hugely badly run and hugely in debt, couldn't the service on their debt. So the Bank of England had to start to pull in banks who they had loaned to see if they could cover their problem. They went to banks. The Scottish banks were unable to help them because the American colonies were indebted, and particularly the Thomas Jefferson, who was he just loved, he was a super consumer. In any event, they could not solve the problem that way. So what they did is they went to Parliament, and Parliament came up with an idea. Well, the East India Company has no cash, but hundreds of tons of tea. What if we made tea so cheap that it would be, then they would be able to pay off their debt? So the tea was that ships had to go from India to London, and there they would be to the American colonies and be taxed again. If they cut out the expense of that extra journey to London and they abolished the tax because they wouldn't be there, the tea would be cheaper. So why the big fuss? Because the Boston and smugglers, of which the same people, this tea sell the smugglers. And that is where a lot of this came from. So there are some interesting kinds of connections. There's also the fact that at the same time that the King of Spain was, of England, were getting attacked by the colonists for changes, not just taxes, but in the empire in ways that were reducing power of what Latin America would be called the Creoles in North America, just the people that are there. The same thing was Portuguese and Spanish empires were also, there were changes in the Atlantic economy and relations between the colonies, and there were outbreaks. There were outbreaks. There was in Brazil. There were in Colombia. So this whole thing was a moment in Atlantic history and the history of colonial empires. Okay, so the last example is the Civil War. The American Civil War, I would argue, is part of the larger history of 19th century liberalism, the invention of the state, and an Atlantic-wide rejection of unfree labor. 1848 was the key date. The 1848 revolutions moved Europe toward republicanism in modern states. In the United States, it was the end of the Mexican War, and the Mexican War had one very important aspect that had to do with slavery. That is, a Pennsylvania Democrat introduced into Congress something called the Wilmot Proviso, that slavery would be forbidden in any lands from Mexico. Texas is another story. We'll leave that one out. But at any event, this started the debate on slavery in real serious central ways, not just abolitionists. It also deeply stirred Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was very, very revolutionary. He was a legislator in the state of Illinois at that time, and he sponsored a bill celebrating the Hungarian 1848 revolutionary. What was the 1848 revolution about? I think it was nationalism and freedom. The nation was to be the vehicle for achieving freedom. Lincoln grasped linkage. He also understood the definition of nation. The nation ought to be culturally homogeneous in the sense that the boundaries of the nation ought to have a certain kind of homogeneity. For Kossuth and the Hungarians, it was language. It was Magyar. For Lincoln, this is where the house divided speech comes. A house divided cannot stand. It had been since the founding of the nation. Why? Because the nation should be homogeneous, in this case, of freedom, rather than of freedom and slavery. That of the nation state out 1848 revolution links nation freedom and a certain kind of unity. This is what the United States is made into a nation. Before the Civil War, the United States was a plural. It was the United States. After the war, the United States it became a singular noun. Abraham Lincoln, in his inaugural, used the word union 29 times and never used the word nation. In his Gettysburg Address in 1863, an address with only 269 words, he used the word nation 5 times. His shift was going to be a wide result of the revolutions. And indeed, that thing too, the United States had its own particular thing, but even on the question of the freeing of the slaves, between 1848 and 1870, 44 million unfree labor were free. 4 million were slaves in the States. The rest were mostly serfs in Russia, but the end of labor was also marked, in which the United States played one role, but in terms of numbers. So there's a federative crisis of making up a new nation state that is going on in Germany and several Latin American countries and the United States. So we're back to a notion, I think, that the history of the States is a part of the history of the larger world, and it is not helpful to separate that. The odd thing is, and this point, is that historians have been slow, although I did name these earlier historians, but in general, the professionalization of history professionalized around the idea that the nation was the unit of history. That's why historians didn't study Africa. Anthropologists studied Africa until you get into really the World War II era. If they don't have archives and, quote, a literature, they aren't subjects of history. If they don't have a nation state, they're not subjects of history. So history is a nation state. This came out of Germany. It was the historical discipline in its modern form was formed there by Leopold von Ranke, the German seminar. And so that was picked up around the world. Interestingly, Ranke, a Hegelian idealist, believed that although the nation was the focus, there was a universal history that they were a part of. That, especially for Americans who were so empirical, that just dropped out. And so we had this self-contained history. Thank you.
Bueno, creo que hay tiempo para puedo romper yo el hielo con preguntas que alguien quiere preguntar. So let me ask you, is it,
Well, listen, you may have
translated. Let me put forward two sort of complementary interpretations of exceptional and see what's your take.
All right.
One is let's say, exceptionalism as a rhetorical device. You could say that Jefferson, James Monroe were trying to transmit the idea of the uniqueness of the American experience as an instrument. They used that as an instrument to oppose it to Europe, because the international context was one in which all Europe could try the former colonies. So as a way of strengthening their arguments against possible intervention, they put forward this idea of a new exceptional historical experience against whole Europe. So it's not that exceptionalism leads to bad policy, but rather that foreign leads to the use of exception. So just speculating. Just,
okay.
the other one. The other one's going back to Madison.
Okay.
Going back in time. Madison and the Federalist Papers. Again, you could think that in the Federalist Papers there is a feeling of a new science of politics being born. This idea of the extended which the world hasn't seen yet. Experiment with federalism and so on. The idea that America is founding a new way of interpreting politics, and again, that is accepted. The world hasn't seen anything like this yet, and we're sort of discovering or inventing this new science of politics for a new phenomenon. And this also feeds these ideas.
Both of these in a specific way, at least. I would frame it a little bit that they understood themselves to be a republic in a world of monarchies, and they felt very vulnerable. I think it was a little bit different than the arrogance of exceptionalism. It was the uniqueness of this, and I think that the Constitution I would see a little bit differently. We're taught about these particular qualities of the Constitution. The main problem there was that they had to do something that would enable them to function. They were unable, as a federation, they were unable either to pay the debts that they owed. They were unable to make treaties because they couldn't get one of the key clauses in the Constitution that was not in the Articles is in the Constitution, and treaties made under the Constitution are the supreme, because they couldn't enforce treaties. We couldn't make treaties with anyone if the 13 states could do anything they wanted. So I actually think it was the international world that pushed the Constitution, and their again ability in it, but it was a sense of weakness not to become superior, but just to be able to be a part of the international world and the like. And they were intensely aware of international law. Benjamin Franklin, who's always ahead for whatever's going on, when he was in England trying to persuade Parliament passing these bad laws, Emmerich on international law. The first name is Emmerich, but it's got a last name that's more important. Vattel. Emmerich Vattel. 1857, he writes what is the Compendium of International Law. Franklin buys 3 copies, brings them back. They bring them when they're talking about the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, there's only 2 places where, well, there's one place of an underlined phrase, a phrase that is used twice. And this is the exact words of Vattel. Be a free state. And they wanted to make sure that they were right. So I guess I want to deeply entangled with and respect nations, although they felt very vulnerable. They thought and hoped that someday the whole world would be republics. They wanted exceptional.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor, as a good historian, let me make a question regarding the future. You very rightly defined capitalism as, I would say, being a role above reality. That, I think, is going to be a very important into the future, because as we globalize more and more, we are going to be much dependent upon the global norms and the global, the non-sustainable exceptionalism and the necessity of being bound by norms into the future.
It's a very good question, and I guess I have two aspects of the response. One is the globalization question. And what that is doing, as you well know, more and more international treaties are participants because they have to be, especially economic, but all kinds of other things. Everything moves fast, including diseases. We're seeing right now in great danger. So I think the necessary movement in that direction. One, whether the International Criminal Court seems like a good global institution for me to be a part of it, but the pressure is in exactly the way you suggest. There's another thing that is really important, and that when the United States, we have to remember that the United States lost this then. I mean, it's the most powerful we've ever been, ever will be. It was devastating. The Soviet Union was obviously a challenge, but at least at the early stages, we were so much in advance of them, and as it turned out, for a longer time than that. The sense of power, that is changing. The world, but it is going to be that way. And the combination of global and a great deal greater equality among the powerful nations, I think will make it much more difficult to hold on to this notion.
I'm sorry, do you allow me to say something? You know, I think that the United States is an exception. The Americans are not an exception. In the United States, the leaders realized that the Americans were not an exception and created a system that was an exception in the world. That was what they call it the rule of law. They defended right, liberty, property, and the right of man to the pursuit of happiness. And they thought that because they, in my thought, I think that they knew what Hume had said. It was not possible to change anything in human nature. The only thing that we could do was to change the situation and make the compliance main interest of the system. And the Americans also, in that system, created the idea that the majority don't have the right to create, to get the right of the minorities. And the other close to this thing is when Madison says, if men were angels, we wouldn't need a government. They were going to govern by angels. Should be, but what is a government? And you see that they never use the word because generals confuse the people, I guess, like people. You see, the Americans were very conscious about the individuals. And so he said, what is a government? It's an administration of men, and they have to control the people and to control themselves. And that's why they created the first system with the judicial review. The Argentine, believe it or not, the second country that started that was Argentina, and unfortunately we changed it, and we're paying for the change. And I hope the Americans will not change them. Now, I don't know what you think about Mr. Obama, but I have my doubts that he will do these things.
That's very interesting, and I think you're largely right. I think that those rights in the rule of law were strong 18th century ideas that grabbing it wasn't wholly original with. I think, though, I have to say, and this includes Madison, a lot of the protections that are in the Constitution are there to protect slavery. And that's a really complicated matter that they were dealing with in the Constitutional Convention. And I agree with you, rights have been quite central to American history and law, but as we all know, I fear, it was not only slavery, but 100 years after the end of slavery, African Americans were they could be killed with no hanged in the South, and no penalty would be there. In part for the good part of our thing, the jury system. So the weakness of right now, as you may know, many states, and it's going through the courts now in very confused ways, many states are trying to prevent particularly Hispanic citizens, or maybe not citizens, to have all kinds of obstacles to voting, having certain kinds of application papers and the like. There are certain things they can't use. That's where the federal government, the Constitution gives a great deal of leeway in organizing elections. And the legacy of a Constitution that was protecting certain rights. Madison used the word that we're not going to have a consolidated government. And that meant leaving a tremendous amount of power in the individual states. We had more than the Confederation, but a lot of that was to enable taxation to pay off our debts and to make treaties with other nations. So it's the idea.
Yes, that is a danger that for.
I mean, you at the very beginning that the idea of being exceptional has taken the U.S. to commit some mistakes in foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Can you mention them? Tell what the mistakes were, and especially in relation to Latin America?
Well, I think that it is this exceptionalism from the usual protocols or national law allows the United States, I mean, at least they think that it enables the United States to do things that would be, that send their gunboats into any number of ports. Take over the customs house in Haiti several times, in Santa Domingo, or Dominican Republic. I mean, this is of we're doing, quote, the right thing, but we're also doing it in ways we shouldn't. I myself really worry about. We've been in wars constantly for the last 30 or 40 years, but we haven't had a declaration of war against anyone since World War II. So it's this attitude, or whatever it is very worrisome. Documented, but it doesn't seem to be, and this includes what Obama's doing right now. In a congressional debate, probably God knows what would happen then. But I think it's, and maybe one thing in Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine, is, you know, that I don't believe, whatever this is worth, when John Quincy with that, I don't think he intended it to be what it became. I believe that he did want to keep monarchy out of the New World. What made us very anxious in Mexico, and in fact, U.S. Grant, the general who won the Civil War for the North, proposed to Lincoln that we put together the Confederate Army and the Union Army, and we go and throw Maximilian out. And incident place or not, it's correct that we can't do that anymore. If anything, the Bush-Cheney regime proved everything they could at it, and it's only made everything worse because we couldn't, quote, finish the job. If you can't finish the job, then you shouldn't start the job. And the really worrisome thing that I worried, I wonder whether Obama's going to be put, will be taking on another job that we haven't got the capacity of what's going on in the Middle East, which we hated. This would be long before that, but the trigger, that I feel terrible. And numbers of people suffering.
La profesora.
A very short comment. I think one of the things that
Necesitamos traducir.